He lit the cigar first. That was the part Zuri Coleman could never fully explain afterward. Not the woman in his bed, not the silk sheets twisted into evidence, not even the way Kang Min-jae looked at her when she opened that door. It was the cigar, lit and burning, like he'd been waiting, like he'd rehearsed exactly how this moment would go and decided, somewhere in the cold architecture of his mind, that he deserved to be comfortable while he destroyed her. 12 hours before their wedding, ivory gown hanging in the next room, 6 years folded into a single hotel suite. He exhaled slowly and said, "You should sit down. If you've ever loved someone so completely that you forgot to keep a piece of yourself back, this story is for you. Stay until the end. Hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Because what Zuri did next, nobody saw it coming, not even him." Well, the message arrived at 11:47 p.m. Zuri was in the middle of a phone call with her business partner back in Atlanta when her personal cell buzzed against the marble vanity. She almost ignored it. The rehearsal dinner had run long, her feet hurt in a way that felt almost philosophical, and she still needed to confirm the florist's delivery window for the cathedral entrance. There were 17 things on her mental checklist, and a text from an unknown number was not one of them. But something made her look. Presidential suite. Come now. Don't tell anyone. She stared at it for 4 seconds. Then she smiled. A small, private smile, because she assumed Min-jae had arranged something. He did things like that sometimes. Grand gestures wrapped in secrecy, orchestrated with the kind of precision that reminded her she was with a man who controlled an empire. He probably had champagne up there. Maybe the necklace she'd mentioned once, offhandedly, at an auction in Singapore 2 years ago. He remembered things like that. He'd always remembered things like that. She told her partner she'd call back in the morning, changed out of her heels into flats because she wasn't going to walk through the Han River Grand Hotel lobby in pain just to satisfy a romantic surprise, and she took the private elevator to the top floor. The hallway was quiet, the kind of quiet that costs money. She knocked once. The door wasn't fully latched. It swung open on its own. That slow cinematic drift that she'd later replay 100 times and still fail to understand. And she stepped inside. The suite was dim. The skyline of Seoul sprawled behind floor-to-ceiling glass like a painting, all lights and river and distance. And there, in the center of the enormous bed, was Kang Min-jae, sitting upright against the headboard with a cigar between his fingers, and Yoon Seo-ah curled against his side, eyes already open, watching the door. Seo-ah looked like she'd been waiting too. Zuri's brain performed a specific kind of shutdown that she'd later try to describe to exactly one person and fail entirely. It wasn't shock, exactly. It was more like the moment your foot reaches for a stair that isn't there. That fraction of a second where the body commits to a step that leads nowhere, and the mind scrambles to catch up with what gravity already knows. She didn't scream, she didn't cry, she didn't say his name. She just stood there, hand still on the doorframe, and looked at Kang Min-jae while he took a slow drag of the cigar and said, "You should sit down." His voice was even, not guilty, not defensive, even. Like a man who had already decided how this conversation would end and was simply waiting for the other parties to catch up. "Min-jae." Her own voice came out steadier than she expected. Flat, like a road that hadn't hit the bridge yet. "I was going to tell you after the wedding," he said. "But I thought this was cleaner." Cleaner. She turned that word over in her mind the way you turn a stone over looking for what lives underneath. Cleaner. As though the primary concern here was efficiency. Seo-ah hadn't moved. She had the kind of stillness that came from preparation, and Zuri recognized it because she'd learned that stillness herself. In boardrooms, in hostile negotiations, in moments when the wrong reaction could cost you everything. Seo-ah was performing control, which meant some part of her wasn't in control at all. That detail mattered, though Zuri couldn't have said why it mattered at 11:53 p.m. while her wedding dress hung 30 floors below. "Tell me what exactly?" Zuri didn't move from the doorframe. Some survival instinct kept her feet planted, kept her body angled toward the exit without consciously choosing it. Min-jae set the cigar in the ashtray on the nightstand. He was wearing the dark navy robe she'd given him last Christmas, which was so absurd a detail that it briefly threatened to undo her composure entirely. He folded his hands in his lap with the deliberateness of a man about to explain a business restructuring. "The wedding proceeds tomorrow," he said. "Everything you've planned, the venue, the guests, the ceremony, all of it happens." "Minjae, but Seoa and I will be legally married, privately, before the ceremony." The words landed with a physical weight, not loud, not dramatic, just weight, the way certain truths have weight when they arrive without warning and you weren't braced. "You're going to be my public wife," he continued. "The face, the legitimate one. What you do for my foundation, what you bring to the business side, that continues. That's valuable. You're valuable, Zuri. I want you to understand I'm not dismissing that." She heard herself exhale, a thin, controlled sound. "You're describing a business arrangement," she said. "I'm describing the reality of my position." He said it without apology. "I have obligations. To the syndicate, to my family, to the woman you never stopped loving." Silence. Seoa shifted slightly against the sheets. Minjae looked at Zuri with something that might have been regret if it weren't so impeccably managed. "Seoa is part of my history in ways I can't separate from who I am. And I'm part of your future in ways that are useful." She said it without venom, just naming the thing. He didn't deny it. That was the moment that actually broke something loose inside her. Not the betrayal, not the woman in his bed, but the fact that when she named what she was to him, he didn't argue. He sat there in her Christmas gift and didn't argue. 6 years. 6 years of flying between Atlanta and Seoul, of learning his language badly and loving him in it anyway, of sitting across negotiating tables from men who didn't respect her and finding a way to make them need her by the end of the meeting, of building something that looked from the outside like a perfect partnership and felt, from the inside, like home. She had believed in that home. "I love you," she said. Not as an argument, just as a fact, as a thing she wanted to say out loud while she still could. Minjae looked at her. "I know." And there it was. Not cruelty, but something worse than cruelty. Acceptance. He accepted her love the way you accept a gift you've already decided you're not keeping. Calmly, without ceremony. Zuri reached up and touched the engagement ring on her left hand. The diamond was 4.2 carats, cushion cut, set in a band engraved with a phrase in Hangul that translated loosely to "only ever you." She had looked at that engraving in the dark some nights just to feel anchored. She worked it off her finger. It took a moment. Her hands were slightly swollen from the warm evening air, and there was something almost darkly funny about the mundane physical difficulty of that moment. The ring came free. She set it on the dresser just inside the door, not on the nightstand, not handed to him, just set down on the nearest available surface, and she straightened. "Good night, Minjae." He blinked. "Zuri, I said good night." She pulled the door closed behind her, quietly. Not a slam, not a controlled performance, just closed, the way you close a door to a room you don't plan to return to. She made it 4 steps down the corridor before her legs informed her they were not entirely reliable at the moment. And she put one hand against the wall and stood there, not crying, not shaking, just breathing with the specific focus of someone who has decided that they are not going to fall apart in a hotel hallway. She gave herself 90 seconds. Then she straightened, rolled her shoulders back, and walked to the elevator. The lobby was mostly empty at that hour. A few late-arriving guests. A concierge who smiled at her with professional warmth. She walked through it like she owned the floor, which was a posture she'd spent 15 years developing and was grateful for now in a way that felt almost savage. Nobody would see her broken in a lobby. Nobody would see her broken anywhere if she could manage it. Her driver was waiting outside. He started to get out to open the door and she waved him off, let herself in, sat in the back seat of the black Mercedes with her hands folded in her lap, and said, "Not the mansion. Take me to the Hannum estate." He glanced in the mirror. "Miss Coleman, the Hannum estate. Please." He drove. The Hannum estate was a property nobody knew about. That was intentional. In 6 years of building a life beside Kong Min-jae, Zuri had watched enough to understand that the most dangerous thing a person could do in his world was to have nothing of their own. So she'd kept that. A property in her name only, registered through a holding company in Singapore, purchased quietly 3 years ago at a point when some instinct she couldn't name had told her to have an exit. She hadn't announced. She hadn't told herself she was planning for this. She'd called it prudence. Sitting in the back of that car, watching Seoul pass in the dark, she thought maybe some part of her had known. The estate was modest by the standards they'd been living. 4 bedrooms, a garden wall, a kitchen that got morning light. She'd furnished it slowly, over 3 years, buying things she actually liked rather than things that performed wealth. There was a worn leather chair in the study she'd shipped from Atlanta, a set of her grandmother's photographs on the landing. Real things. Hers. She let herself in, didn't bother with most of the lights, went to the kitchen and filled a glass of water and stood at the counter drinking it in the dark, with the kind of deliberateness that was really just staying upright one action at a time. Then she sat down at the kitchen table and allowed herself 4 minutes of something that wasn't quite crying, more of a controlled shaking, the way a structure settles after impact, not collapsing but accommodating damage. 4 minutes. She set a timer. When it went off, she pressed both palms flat on the table and breathed until the shaking stopped. Then she opened her phone and stared at the contact she'd been professionally courteous to for 3 years and personally wary of for most of that time, Han Jun-seok, leader of the Dragon Crown organization, Min Jae's oldest and most capable rival. A man she'd met exactly 11 times across various functions and found each time to be startlingly and inconveniently straightforward for someone who operated in the dark. She didn't have a plan. She had a thread. She pulled it. The phone rang twice before he answered. Coleman. His voice was alert, not irritated, which meant either he'd been awake or he operated on a level of professional readiness that made sleep optional. Jun-seok. A pause. It's past midnight. I know. Another pause, and then with a directness that she later recognized as a fundamental quality of his character rather than a tactic. Are you safe? Not what do you want? Not why are you calling? Not even how did you get this number, which he had to know she'd gotten through channels that weren't technically proper. Just, are you safe? Something in her chest shifted. Not softened, Bob. Shifted. The way weight redistributes when a surface becomes unexpectedly reliable. Physically, she said. Yes. Tell me. She told him. Not everything, not in that first call. She told him the architecture of it, Min Jae's plan, the legal marriage to Seoa, her own position as a public facade. She told him cleanly, without editorializing, with the same detached precision she used in board meetings when she was presenting problems she'd already begun solving. When she finished, there was a silence on the line that felt considered rather than empty. What do you want to do? He asked. I don't know yet. I'm still... She stopped, started again. I need options. Come in tonight. I'll have counsel here. I'm not looking to be absorbed into another arrangement, Jun-seok. I know. He said it like he meant it. Come in. She went. His compound was across the river, guarded without being theatrical about it, the kind of security that was invisible until it needed not to be. She was received without ceremony, which she appreciated. Taken to a study where 2 attorneys were already present, she recognized one of them from a transaction she'd observed in an adjacent negotiation 2 years prior, the kind of detail Min Jae never thought she noticed. Jun-seok was already in the room when she entered. He was taller than she consistently remembered, with a stillness about him that was different from Min Jae's. Less performed, more load-bearing, like a wall rather than a display. He stood when she came in, offered his hand, and she shook it. No preamble, no condolences. She was grateful for that too. They talked for 2 hours. The attorneys were thorough. Jun-seok was direct about what he was offering and why. A legal marriage between Zuri Coleman and Han Jun-seok, entered into before dawn, registered under full legal standing, with a prenuptial agreement that she drafted the terms of herself. Her assets, her companies, her donor network, her independence, untouched. The right to dissolve the arrangement at any point of her choosing with a settlement structure she set. His single ask plainly stated, her presence at certain functions, her credibility attached to his name in the legitimate business space, the same value she'd provided Min Jae, but this time with terms. Why, she asked at one point, not because she didn't understand the strategic logic, but because she wanted to hear him say it. Because Min Jae has been borrowing your credibility for 6 years and calling it his own, Jun-seok said. And because I'd rather have an honest arrangement than a pretty fiction, She looked at him across the table. And if I decide in 6 months that I want to leave? The exit structure is in paragraph 9. Your attorney should have flagged it. He glanced at the documents in front of her. I'm not interested in keeping anyone who doesn't want to be kept. Zuri sat with that for a moment. Then she picked up the pen. They signed the documents at 4:17 a.m. A judge that Jun Seok had clearly retained for exactly this kind of contingency presided without visible judgment. The marriage was legal, registered, and entirely documented by 4:31. Outside the study window, Seoul was beginning its slow turn toward dawn. The sky had that particular quality of not quite dark that preceded every new thing. Zuri stood at the glass for a moment and looked out at the city. Her city now in some complicated and real way, the city where she'd given 6 years of herself to a man who'd received those years and filed them under useful. Her wedding dress was still hanging 30 floors up in a hotel room she would not return to. By noon, the city expected a wedding. She was going to give them one. The judge left without shaking anyone's hand. That was fine. Zuri didn't need ceremony. She needed the paperwork, and she had it. 2 copies, notarized, folded into a document envelope that she tucked into her bag with the same methodical care she used to file quarterly reports. The marriage certificates of Zuri Coleman and Han Jun Seok existed now in the physical world. It had a case number. It had a seal. It was more real than 6 years of promises delivered in low light. Jun Seok's attorneys gathered their things without small talk, which she appreciated. One of them, the younger one, with the careful eyes, glanced at her once on his way out, something between respect and professional concern, and then thought better of whatever he'd considered saying, and left. The study was quiet. Jun Seok poured 2 glasses of water from a carafe on the sideboard. He carried one to where she was standing and set it near her without pressing it into her hand, without making it a gesture. Just placed it there in case she wanted it. Then he leaned against the edge of the desk and looked out the same window she'd been looking through. You should sleep, he said. I won't. I know, but you should. She picked up the water and drank half of it. Outside, the sky was the particular gray of early morning that had no warmth in it yet, just light arriving out of obligation. In approximately 7 hours, guests would begin arriving at the cathedral. Flowers were already in transit. The catering crew had likely been setting tables since midnight. Min-jae will have heard something by 6, she said. Probably earlier. He has people in this district. Will they report accurately? Jun Seok considered. They'll report that you came here. The rest depends on how much they saw. He paused. He won't know about the marriage until you tell him, or until it becomes impossible not to know. And which do you prefer? He looked at her then, level, unhurried. I prefer whatever you decide. She set the glass down. The prenuptial agreement had 23 pages, and she'd read every one of them twice, annotating in the margins with the pen his attorney handed her, crossing 2 clauses and substituting language that more precisely reflected what she was and wasn't agreeing to. He'd accepted every change without negotiation. That detail sat with her now in a way she hadn't had time to examine properly. I need a room, she said, not to sleep, to work. He showed her to a small office off the main corridor. Bookshelves, a desk that faced the window, a laptop she declined in favor of her own. He left her there. He didn't ask what she was working on. She had spent 6 years with a man who always asked what she was working on, and she understood now that she'd interpreted that as interest when it had been something closer to inventory. She opened her laptop and began. By 5:40 a.m., she had drafted 12 emails and sent none of them. They sat in her drafts folder like loaded guns. Resignation letters, primarily, from the board of the Coleman Kong Foundation, from her advisory position at 3 companies where her presence had been the critical factor in securing legitimacy with international investors, from the charitable committee whose annual gala had raised 40 million won last year, largely because her name was on the invitation. She read them over once each, changed a word here and there, not because the content needed it, but because her hands needed something to do, while her mind ran the calculations she'd been running since the hotel room. The numbers were not in Minji's favor. They hadn't been for some time, though he didn't know that, because what you don't track you don't miss until it's gone. She opened a separate file and began a different kind of document. Not a resignation, something more like a ledger. She was still writing at 7:15 when her phone rang. It was Amara, her assistant, her personal assistant, not the one the foundation provided. Amara, who had been with her for 4 years and who Zuri trusted in the specific and limited way you trust people who've seen you at your worst and chosen to keep showing up. "The stylist is at the hotel," Amara said. "No greeting." Amara didn't do greetings before 9. "She's asking where you are." "Tell her I'll need the dress and the emergency kit brought to a different address." A pause. "Zuri?" "I know." "Where are you?" "Hanum side." She hesitated. "Amara, I need you to not ask me questions right now. I need you to write down an address and bring the dress and do the thing you do where you make sure the hair doesn't collapse in humidity." "It's your wedding day." "I know what day it is." Another pause. Longer. Then, "Address." She gave it. She heard Amara write it down without comment, which meant Amara had already intuited that something had shifted and was calculating what her job looked like in that shifted reality. Amara was good at that. It was why Zuri paid her exceptionally well. "The stylist will have questions," Amara said. "Tell her I changed hotels. Tell her anything. You're creative." "I'll be there by 8:30. The call ended. Zuri set the phone down and stared at the window for exactly 45 seconds. Then she went back to the ledger. She was 3 pages in when Jun Seok appeared in the doorway with coffee. He set it on the corner of the desk and looked at what was on her screen without asking, which was either a breach of privacy or an act of confidence, and she decided, without much deliberation, that it was the latter. "He built the import licensing network on my relationships," she said without looking up. "The Lim family introduction? That was me. The Park Foundation chair? That was a college friend of mine from Columbia. The legitimacy audit that cleared the syndicate's holdings for the property development bid. The auditing firm was one I'd worked with in Atlanta." Jun Seok said nothing. "He knows all of this," she continued. "He just believed I wouldn't use it." "Why did he believe that?" She looked up. "Because I loved him. And people who love you are supposed to be safe. They're supposed to stay." She watched Jun Seok absorb that. He didn't react to it emotionally, which wasn't coldness. It was more like respect. Like he understood the weight of what she'd said and wasn't going to diminish it by responding quickly. "Are you going to the cathedral?" he asked. "Yes." "In the dress?" "In the dress." He nodded once. "Then I'll get ready." She almost said something then, almost asked him why he was doing this, beyond the strategic logic, beyond the transfer of influence, and the rivalry with Min Jae that spanned years she hadn't been present for. She almost asked if any part of it was personal in a way that the prenuptial agreement didn't cover. But she didn't, because it was 7:30 in the morning and she had a cathedral to arrive at, and some questions needed to be asked when there was enough time to hear the answer properly. She drank the coffee instead. It was good coffee. She filed that away. Amara arrived at 8:22 with dress in a garment bag, the emergency kit, and an expression of absolute professional neutrality that Zuri recognized as the face Amara made when she had formed a complete opinion and was actively choosing not to share it. They set up in the guest room Jun Seok's housekeeper showed them to. The stylist was not there. Amara had apparently handled that. Zuri didn't ask how. Amara worked in silence for 11 minutes, doing the specific skilled work of making someone look composed when they hadn't slept. Foundation. Setting spray. The kind of under-eye work that was effectively invisible but changed everything. Zuri sat in the chair and let her, watching herself in the mirror with a detachment that felt earned. "Your mother called," Amara said, not stopping what she was doing. "I know." "She's called 4 times since 6. "I know." "She's at the cathedral. She flew in from Amara." Zuri met her eyes in the mirror. "I know." Amara pressed her lips together, kept working. After another minute, she said at lower volume, "Are you all right?" "No." "Okay." She reached for the setting spray. "Good. Because you shouldn't be." That, unexpectedly, was the right thing to say. Zuri felt something ease fractionally in her chest. Not the weight of it, but the aloneness of it. She had been afraid that the composure she was maintaining meant she was performing strength she didn't have. Amara's acknowledgement that all right was the wrong standard made it easier to keep sitting up straight. The dress went on at 9:15. Ivory, structured, with a neckline that was architectural without being severe. She had chosen it 8 months ago at a fitting in Milan, standing in front of mirrors with Min Jae's credit card and her own conviction that she was choosing something for a life she wanted. She had wanted it. That was the part that didn't fit cleanly into any of the calculations. She had genuinely wanted the life she thought they were building. She looked at herself in the full-length mirror and thought, I would have made him a good wife. Then she thought, he didn't deserve one. She picked up her bag. The document envelope was inside it. She touched it once through the leather, just briefly, the way you check something you need to know is there. Ready? Amar asked. No, Zuri said. Let's go. Junseok was in the main corridor when she came out. He was wearing a dark suit, charcoal, sharply cut, the kind of tailoring that cost enough to be invisible about it. He'd clearly dressed quickly, but you couldn't tell. He looked at her when she came down the hallway, and there was a moment, brief and uncomplicated, where he simply looked. No assessment, no appreciation performed for an audience. Just a human registering another human. The cars are ready, he said. How many? 4. Yours first, then mine. We arrive separately. You go in first. She nodded. And then you. When the moment is right. She studied him. You're going to enjoy this. Something shifted at the edge of his expression. Not quite a smile. Min Jae has been running a very specific story about his own importance for a long time. I've had to listen to it from a professional distance. He picked up his jacket from the chair. Yes, I'll enjoy this. The drive to the cathedral took 22 minutes. Zuri sat in the back of the car with her hands in her lap and watched Seoul arrange itself around her through the tinted glass. The city was beautiful in the morning, that specific beauty of a place that holds millions of lives and doesn't particularly notice yours among them. She had loved this city. She still did, she thought. Complicated love for a complicated place. Her mother called again at 9:47. This time she answered. Zuri Coleman, where are you? Her mother's voice had that particular frequency that could only be generated by a black woman in her 60s who had already been sitting in a cathedral for 40 minutes, watching other people's problems become her problems. On my way, Mama. The coordinator has asked me 3 times where you are, and I have told her 3 times that my daughter is punctual and will be here. And if you make me a liar in front of all these people, I won't be late. Your dress, I'm wearing it. A pause. Her mother's voice dropped half a register. Baby, something is wrong. It wasn't a question. Her mother had always had that capacity, could read the specific texture of Zuri's voice the way she read weather. Zuri had both resented and relied on it her entire life. I'll explain everything, Zuri said. Not right now. But I promise you will understand, and I promise you will be okay with it. Zuri, do you trust me, Mama? The pause that followed was only 3 seconds, but it contained 35 years of history. Yes, her mother said. Lord help me. Good. Find a seat with a good view of the entrance. She ended the call. The cathedral courtyard appeared around a long curve of road, stone and old trees, and the particular dignity of a building that had watched a great many human decisions get made on its steps. The parking area was already filling. She could see the guests arriving, the specific population of souls powerful dressed in their best, the women in silk and the men in the structured dark suits that indicated they understood this was a significant occasion. Cameras from 3 networks were already positioned outside the cordon. Her driver pulled to the private entrance on the south side. She got out herself, didn't wait, walked through the side door and into the cool interior of the building, and that was where she found Min Jae. He was standing in the antechamber, alone, his back to the door. She'd known he might be here. The schedule placed the groom's arrival at this entrance at 9:30, and Min Jae was never late to anything. She'd known and had decided not to change course because there was nothing left to say that would make this easier, and she was done with easier. He heard the door, turned. For 2 full seconds he simply looked at her. Then something crossed his face that she hadn't seen in years. Something young, something that might have been relief. You came, he said. I said I would. He took a step toward her. Last night. Don't. He stopped. I didn't come here to fight with you in a hallway, she said. Her voice was steady. She'd practiced the steadiness, sitting in the car, and it was holding. I came here because I have something to say, and I want to say it in front of everyone who matters to you. That's the only reason I'm standing here. His jaw tightened. You're angry. I'm not angry, Min Jae. She looked at him. That's the part you should be worried about. If I were angry, you'd know how to handle it. She shifted the bag slightly on her shoulder. I'm done. You don't mean that. I was married this morning. The silence that fell was not a natural silence. It was the specific, material silence of a fact landing in a space that hasn't been built to contain it. She watched it move across his face, confusion first, then the beginning of something harder. What did you say? At 4:30 this morning, legal, registered, documented. She held his gaze. All the things you were going to do in secret, I did first, and not in secret. Min-jae stared at her. He was a man who had sat across tables from people who wanted him dead and shown nothing. She had watched him do it. She knew the architecture of his composure, knew how solid it was, knew it had been built over decades of necessity. And she watched it develop, for the first time since she'd known him, a crack. Who? He said, flat, dangerous. She had thought about this moment, whether to say it here, whether to make him walk into that courtyard already knowing, or whether to let it unfold in public where neither of them could lose control of the shape of it. She had decided, in the car, that he deserved to know before he walked out there, not as mercy, but because she wanted to look him in the eye when she said it. Han Jun-seok. The crack widened, not on his face held barely, but in his posture, in the particular way his right hand opened and then closed again at his side, in the half-second where his breath changed. You're lying, he said. The registration number is on file with the Civil Records Office. You can have someone check in the next 4 minutes if you want. Jun-seok. He said the name like a piece of glass. You went to Jun-seok. He asked if I was safe, she said. You told me to sit down. That landed. She watched it land. Min-jae took a single step forward, and she didn't move, held her ground, and he stopped himself. Physically stopped himself, the way a man stops himself when he remembers who's watching or who he's supposed to be, except there was no one watching here, and that made the stopping more interesting. You understand what you've done, he said. I understand exactly what I've done. This isn't… He pressed his lips together. This is not how this works. You can't just… There are 400 people in that courtyard, she said, who came here believing they were watching something real. I'm going to go out there and tell them the truth. All of it. She paused. You can stand next to me, or you can stand across from me. That's the only choice you have left. She walked past him. He didn't stop her. She was almost at the inner door before he spoke again, and his voice had dropped to something low and tight and more honest than anything she'd heard from him in years. 6 years, Zuri. She stopped, didn't turn. 6 years and you walk out with him in one night. She stood there for a moment, thought about what to say, thought about the hotel room, the cigar, the word cleaner, the Christmas robe, the engraved ring sitting on a dresser 30 floors up. 6 years and you planned it for longer, she said. We were just counting different things. She pushed through the inner door. The light from the courtyard hit her like a physical force, morning sun bouncing off the stone and the assembled cameras and the hundreds of faces turning toward the entrance as the doors opened. She heard the collective shift of the crowd, that subtle atmospheric change when everyone in a large space redirects their attention to the same point. Her mother was in the 4th row on the left, as she'd suspected. She found Amar's face near the back. She saw investors she recognized, politicians she'd managed, a senator's wife she'd sat next to at the foundation gala 3 months ago. She walked to the center of the courtyard steps and stopped. Someone near the back called out something she didn't catch. A camera moved. The coordinator, a woman in headset and controlled panic, started toward her from the left flank, and Zuri looked at her once and she stopped. The courtyard went quiet in the way things go quiet when people sensed that what's about to happen was not on the program. Zuri reached into her bag. She retrieved the document envelope and held it without opening it, just held it, and she stood in her ivory dress in the morning light in front of everyone Min-jae had ever needed to believe in him, and she began to speak. I know you all came here expecting a wedding, she said. Her voice carried. She'd spent years making sure her voice carried in spaces that weren't built for her. And I want to be honest with you about what you're actually here to witness. From the corner of her eye, she saw the line of black sedans entering the courtyard gate. She did not stop speaking. She did not look at the cars. She kept her eyes on the crowd and her voice level and her shoulders back, and behind her she heard the cathedral door open, and she knew without turning that Min-jae had followed her out, and she knew the moment he saw the convoy because the quality of the silence behind her changed entirely. The lead car stopped. The door opened. Han Jun-seok stepped out. He looked at her across the courtyard and waited. She lifted the envelope slightly. Not a flourish, not theatrical, just the specific gesture of a woman placing a fact in front of an audience. And she said clearly, into the silence that had consumed 400 people and 3 cameras and the entire carefully constructed mythology of Kang Min-jae's empire, "I was married this morning, and I have some things to tell you about how we all got here." The courtyard held its breath. 400 people, and not one of them moved. Zuri could feel it, that specific suspension of collective disbelief. The moment a crowd realizes the script they were handed at the door is not the script being performed. Cameras were rolling. She could see the red lights on 2 of the network rigs, and a third operator who had started walking forward without realizing he was doing it, pulled by instinct toward whatever this was becoming. Han Jun-seok stood beside his car and waited. He was good at waiting. She'd noted that about him in the hours since midnight, the absence of urgency, the way he occupied time without filling it unnecessarily. Min-jae had always filled silence, had always needed to fill it. She heard Min-jae's footsteps on the stone behind her. Measured, controlled. He was working to control them, and she could tell the difference between his natural walk and this one, which was 3 years of watching him move through rooms that belonged to him. He came to stand 6 feet to her right, not beside her, not behind her. 6 feet to the right, which was a positioning choice, deliberate, designed to suggest parallel rather than opposition. She recognized the tactic. He was trying to make them look like 2 people presenting a united front while he figured out what was happening. The crowd saw him, and a murmur moved through it like wind through a field. "Zuri." His voice was low, pitched for her alone. "Think about what you're doing." She didn't look at him. "I've been thinking about it since midnight. I'm done thinking." She lifted the document envelope and opened it. The marriage certificate came out clean, a single unfolded page that caught the morning light. She didn't hold it up for the crowd. This wasn't theater, or it wasn't only theater. She just held it, visible, and let the cameras find it. 6 years ago, she said, and her voice filled the courtyard the way she had trained it to fill rooms. "I came to Seoul with a business proposal and a belief that I could build something real here. I met Kang Min-jae at a development conference. He was 31, I was 28. He told me Seoul was a city that rewarded people who knew how to create value." A sound from Min-jae's direction. Not a word. Something tighter than a word. "He was right about that," she continued. "I created a great deal of value. The Lim family's introduction to the syndicate's property development arm. That was through a contact I developed at Columbia. The international legitimacy audit that cleared the Baeko holdings for the Gangnam development bid. The auditing firm was Chen and Associates, which I had a 7-year relationship with before I ever met Min-jae. The Coleman Kong Foundation, the charitable work that positioned this organization as a community partner rather than a liability. I built that. Every board member I recruited, every donor I called, every government relationship I managed." The murmur in the crowd had changed quality. It was no longer surprise. It was the sound of people recalibrating. "Last night," Zuri said, and here she paused, not for effect but because the sentence required a breath. 12 hours before the ceremony, Kang Min-jae informed me that he would be legally marrying another woman before today's ceremony, and I would serve as his public wife. A face. A useful one. Complete silence. She heard someone in the 4th row, her mother, she was almost certain, make a sound that was somewhere between a sharp inhale and a word that didn't make it all the way out. Min-jae stepped forward. "That is a significant mischaracterization of, is it not true?" She turned and looked at him directly for the first time since she'd walked out of that antechamber. Looked at him with the full force of a woman who had spent a sleepless night becoming someone he had never adequately accounted for. "Was Yoon Seo not in your suite last night? Did you not tell me the wedding would proceed as a public arrangement? Did you not use the word cleaner?" His jaw was tight. Something moved through his eyes. Not guilt, she thought, but the specific calculation of a man determining which version of this he could still survive. "This is not the place." "You chose the place," she said. "You invited 400 people to witness a commitment you never intended to keep. That's a choice about place." She turned back to the crowd. And that was when the first thing went wrong. Not with Minjae, not with the cameras or the crowd or the document in her hand. The first thing that went wrong came from the left side of the courtyard, from a figure moving through the seated guests toward the open central aisle with a speed and purposefulness that Zuri clocked 2 seconds before she understood what she was looking at. Yoon Seo-ah. She was dressed impeccably, pale gray, understated, the kind of outfit that said, "I am not competing for attention," which was itself a form of competing for attention. She moved with the composure of someone who had also spent the night preparing. Her eyes were fixed on Zuri, and they were not the eyes of a woman who had been caught and was afraid. They were the eyes of a woman with information. Zuri felt the first whisper of something cold at the base of her throat. Not fear exactly, the precursor to fear. The body's way of saying, recalculate. Seo-ah stopped at the edge of the open aisle, 12 feet from where Zuri stood. She looked at the crowd, briefly, professionally, like someone who had addressed rooms before and found them manageable. And then she looked at Zuri. "May I speak?" she said. Her Korean-accented English was precise and quiet, and the acoustics of the stone courtyard carried it the way they carried everything. Zuri said nothing, which was, she knew, functionally the same as yes. Seo-ah reached into her bag and produced a phone. She tapped it twice and then held it up toward the nearest camera operator. "I'd like that to be visible, if possible." The operator, operating on pure instinct at this point, stepped forward and the screen filled the frame. The image on it was a document, dense text, a corporate filing header, a signature line. "The Coleman Kong Foundation," Seo-ah said, and her voice was steady in a way that Zuri now recognized was practiced, "was incorporated with dual fiduciary control. Ms. Coleman is correct that she built it. What she may not have disclosed is that she also signed a binding fiduciary agreement in year 2 of the Foundation's operation that requires board approval for any severance of executive leadership. She cannot simply resign." Seo-ah lowered the phone. "The board has 7 members. Minjae holds 3 proxies." Zuri's grip on the document envelope tightened, 1 millimeter, enough that only she felt it. "Furthermore," Seo-ah continued, and there was nothing triumphant in her tone, which was somehow worse than triumph. "The investor relationships Miss Coleman referenced, the Lim family, the Chen audit firm, the Park Foundation, all operating agreements between those parties, and the Baeko Syndicate's legitimate arms include continuity clauses. Ms. Coleman's departure without a 12-month transition protocol triggers financial penalties on those agreements, not for her personally, for the organization she is claiming to have built." Someone in the crowd said something in Korean that Zuri didn't catch. Zuri stood still. She was aware of Jun Seok across the courtyard, watching, aware of her mother's face in the 4th row, aware of the cameras. Aware, in the sharpened way of someone who has just had the ground reconfigured beneath their feet, that this was a prepared response. That last night, while she had been signing papers and drinking coffee and writing a ledger in a borrowed office, Seo-ah had been doing her own preparation. The question was how long that preparation had been underway. "You knew," Zuri said. Not to the crowd, to Seo-ah. Seo-ah looked at her. "I knew Minjae was going to tell you last night, yes." "How long?" A pause that lasted 1 second too long. "How long did you know?" Zuri asked again, and her voice had dropped to a register she didn't use often. Quiet, precise, the verbal equivalent of a door closing. 3 months, Seo-ah said. 3 months. Zuri ran that number against her recent history in the time it took to blink. 3 months ago, she had been in Tokyo closing a donor commitment for the Foundation's expansion initiative. 3 months ago, she had had dinner with Minjae at a restaurant they both loved, and he had ordered her drink before she arrived because he remembered what she wanted, and she had thought, "This is real. This is the thing I'm building my life on." 3 months. And the fiduciary agreement, Zuri said, the continuity clause. Drafted 8 months ago. Seo-ah held her gaze. After you mentioned in a board meeting that you were considering a restructuring of your personal holdings. 8 months. Someone had been listening in that board meeting. Someone had taken a passing remark about personal financial restructuring and begun quietly constructing a cage around everything she'd built. She had mentioned restructuring as a hypothetical, almost an aside, and someone in that room had heard it as a warning and responded by tightening the architecture of her own foundation around her. She looked at Minjae. He was watching her with an expression that was the most honest thing she'd seen on his face in possibly years. Not guilt, not defiance, but a kind of careful assessment. He was watching her absorb this and calculating whether she was going to survive the absorption. "You built a trap," she said. "I built contingencies," he said, "for a scenario I hoped wouldn't happen." "But you built them." He said nothing. "While I was running your foundation," she said, and her voice stayed level through what felt like an act of physical force. "While I was making your calls and managing your relationships and telling myself I was building something for us, you were building a box for me. I was protecting the organization. You were protecting your control of it." She stepped toward him. One step. The crowd's silence at this point was absolute. Not the silence of people being polite, but the silence of people afraid to move and miss something. That's different. That is a fundamentally different thing, and I want you to stand here in front of everyone who has ever believed in the story you've been telling and say it correctly. Min-jae's eyes moved to Jun Seok. A brief look, cold and direct and carrying 6 years of professional enmity. Then back to Zuri. "This conversation is not for an audience. Every conversation I've had with you for 6 years has been shaped by audiences you were managing. This one's mine." Something shifted in his posture, not weakness. Min-jae didn't have that gear, but a recognition, a recalibration. She'd seen it once before, in a negotiation in Busan where the other side had revealed a position he hadn't anticipated, and he'd stood very still for 11 seconds and then found a new angle. He was doing that now, standing very still, finding the angle. "The Foundation's restrictions," he said carefully, "can be resolved. The continuity clauses can be renegotiated. None of this has to become what you're making it." "What am I making it?" "A public destruction of something we built together." "Something I built," she said, "with your name attached to it." Seoa had not moved from her position. Zuri was aware of her in the peripheral vision the way you are aware of something that requires monitoring. She had made a mistake. She could see it clearly now, in the way the sequence had unfolded. She had assumed last night was Min-jae acting alone, that Seoa was a presence, a wound, but not an operative. She had not accounted for Seoa as a strategist. That was her mistake. She owned it in the 4 seconds she gave herself to be honest before moving forward. "Jun Seok." She spoke across the courtyard. He looked at her. "The Lim agreement. Do you have exposure to it?" He took 2 seconds. "Our organization has no direct relationship with the Lim family's current holdings. Adjacent. Not direct. Not perfect. But workable." "Chen and Associates," she said. "I can make a call." Min-jae stepped forward sharply. "You are not going to dismantle." "I'm not dismantling anything," Zuri said, turning to face him with a steadiness that surprised even herself. "Everything I built still exists. The foundation, the relationships, the donor network. I'm simply notifying the people in this courtyard, many of whom are on those boards and those donor lists, that the organizational structure they've trusted has been operating under a control mechanism I wasn't aware of, and I'm letting them decide what they want to do with that information." She looked at the crowd again, found the face of Lee Sang-chul, who chaired the development trust and whose wife was currently watching from the 3rd row with an expression of absolute focused attention. Found Director Park, who oversaw the foundation's government liaison. Found 3 others she needed to find. "The continuity clauses Seoa mentioned are real," she said, addressing the crowd directly. "I didn't know about them. You should know that I didn't know, and you should also know that any organization whose leadership can be structurally locked in place without their knowledge is an organization whose governance has a problem." She paused. "I'd encourage the board members present to request a full governance review before authorizing any operations in my name." Lee Sang-chul stood up. Just stood up from his seat in the 2nd row, which in this context was its own form of statement. Min-jae saw it. His composure developed a second crack. "Sang-chul," he said. His tone had warning in it, that particular low frequency that Zuri had observed him use exactly 4 times in 6 years, always successfully. Lee Sang-chul looked at Min-jae for a long moment. Then he looked at Zuri. Then he sat back down, took out his phone, and began typing. That was a vote, not a dramatic one. But in the specific economy of power that Min-jae operated in, a man like Lee Sang-chul typing on his phone in the middle of a confrontation was a defection. Seoa recognized it too. Zuri saw her chin lower slightly. Min-jae crossed the courtyard in 8 steps and stood in front of Zuri, close enough that this became a private conversation despite the audience. And his voice dropped to the register she'd heard only in hotel rooms and in the back of cars and in the 3 or 4 moments in 6 years when he'd shown her something that felt unguarded. "You think Jun Seok is different," he said. "You think what happened this morning is a choice you made freely." "It was." "He came to you inside of 8 hours, Min-jae said. "You called him at midnight, and by 4 in the morning you were signing papers. That is not a man offering you freedom. That is a man moving faster than I did." The words found purchase, not because she believed them entirely, but because they found the edge of the thing she hadn't examined. She had noted it herself, in the car, the speed of it, the efficiency of Jun Seok's response, the way the attorneys had been already present. "I negotiated my own terms," she said. "You negotiated inside the structure he built for you to negotiate inside." Min-jae's eyes were direct, and there was something in them she hadn't expected. Not anger, not calculation, but something more painful. Something that looked, at extreme proximity, like a man who understood exactly what he'd destroyed and was watching the consequence arrive. "I know him, Zuri. I have known him for 15 years. He does not do anything without a reason that serves him." "Neither do you." "No," he said. "But you knew my reasons. You knew them for 6 years." Silence. Between them, specifically. The crowd existed at a remove. She held his gaze. Behind his eyes, she could see the architecture of it. The years, the actual years, the meals and the arguments, and the way he called her name when he was tired, and the look on his face the first time she walked into a board meeting and saved a deal he'd already written off. She could see all of it, and she could also see the hotel suite and the cigar and COA's pre-prepared fiduciary documents and the board proxies and the box he'd built while she wasn't looking. She stepped back. 1 step. "Here's what I know," she said quietly. "I know you told me to sit down. I know Jun Seok asked if I was safe." She held his eyes. "That's the whole story. Everything else is negotiable. That isn't." She turned away from him. Jun Seok was walking across the courtyard toward her, not rushing, not performing, walking with that load-bearing steadiness she'd catalogued since 1 a.m. When he reached her, he stopped at her side, close but not touching, and looked out at the crowd with an expression of absolute calm. Min-jae looked at him. "You think you've won something." "I think you made a series of choices," Jun Seok said. "I made a different one." "She is not a prize." "No," Jun Seok said. "She's a partner, which is why I gave her the pen and let her write her own terms." He paused. "You should try that sometime." The muscle in Min-jae's jaw was doing what it did when he was making a calculation he didn't like the answer to. Zuri had seen that muscle hundreds of times. She had once found it almost endearing. Now she watched it and felt nothing except a clean, clear awareness of the distance she'd traveled between then and now. Seoa crossed the courtyard in Zuri's peripheral vision. She came to stand beside Min-jae, and that pairing, the two of them, together, publicly, for the first time in Zuri's presence, landed on the crowd like a confirmation. A rumble moved through the assembled guests, the sound of subtext becoming text. A camera operator stepped 3 feet closer, and then Seoa did something Zuri had not anticipated. She reached into her bag a second time and produced a second document, this one thicker, bound, with colored tabs along the edge, and she extended it toward Zuri. "Before you finish," Seoa said, and her voice was still steady, still precise, "you should see this." Zuri did not take it immediately. She looked at it, looked at Seoa's face, looked at Min-jae, who was watching the document with an expression she couldn't read, which was itself notable. She could usually read Min-jae, and his opacity toward that document meant either he hadn't prepared this part or he had prepared it and was managing his expression about it. She took it. She opened it to the first tab. The top document was a financial transfer record. She recognized the format. It was from the same banking institution she used for the foundation's international transactions. She read the figures. She read them again. The blood moved differently in her body for approximately 4 seconds. The transfer record documented a payment from a Singapore holding company, not her holding company, a different one, similar structure, to a legal firm in Zurich. The amount was significant. The date was 18 months ago. The notation in the transfer memo read, "CC retainer, Exit documentation. Cece, Coleman, her family's original business entity, dissolved before she moved to Seoul. Before. It had been dissolved before she'd ever met Min Jae. She turned to the second tab, corporate registration documents, the Singapore holding company, director listing. Her name was not on it, but the registered address was an apartment in Singapore she had lived in for 6 months, 8 years ago, before Seoul, before Min Jae, when she was building her first international footprint and using a short-term furnished rental on a 6-month lease. Someone used your old address, Jun Seok said quietly, reading over her shoulder. Someone built a company at my old address, Zuri said. Her voice had a quality she didn't entirely recognize, something stripped and precise, and ran money through it. She turned to the third tab. It was a photograph. Corporate event, a function she half recognized. The format, the table settings, the style of the room said Seoul, said 3 or 4 years ago, said the kind of dinner where deals got made between courses. She was in the photograph. She could see herself at the far right of the frame, in conversation with someone just off the edge of the image. Standing in the center of the frame, shaking hands with a man she recognized as a mid-level Baeco official, was Han Jun Seok. 18 months before he claimed they had never had any professional interaction. Zuri went very still. That photograph is from the Sungwon Group dinner, Seoa said. March 3 years ago. You were there. Jun Seok was there. You were introduced by Director Choi, who sat between you for approximately 20 minutes. She paused. He told you this morning that he knew you only by reputation. The stone of the courtyard was very solid beneath her feet. She was aware of its solidity in the specific way you become aware of the ground when your orientation shifts. She thought about the study, the coffee, the prenuptial agreement with 23 pages she'd annotated, the attorneys who were already present at 1 in the morning, the judge retained in advance. The question, are you safe? The way it had landed, the way she'd let it land. She turned and looked at Han Jun Seok. His face was composed. His eyes were on the document in her hands, and they were not surprised. He was not surprised. A man who was innocent of what this document implied would be surprised. He would be reaching for an explanation or asking to see it or saying her name. He was doing none of those things. He was standing still, calculating, the same way Min Jae had stood still in the antechamber. 2 men, 2 calculations. And she was standing between them in an ivory dress holding proof that neither story she'd been told was the complete one. When? She said. Her voice came out quiet, almost reasonable. When did you know I'd call you? Jun Seok looked at her. His jaw shifted slightly. When did you know? She said again, and this time it wasn't quiet. The courtyard heard it. The cameras heard it. Her mother heard it. She could see her mother's face in the 4th row, stricken and rigid, and she looked away from it because she couldn't afford that right now. She could not afford to feel her mother's face. Jun Seok said, the situation was, answer the question. He looked at her for a long moment. And in that moment, in the specific quality of his silence, she received the answer she had not wanted. He had known it was possible. He had positioned for it. The attorneys at 1 in the morning, the judge on retainer, the prenuptial language she'd been allowed to draft herself. All of it designed to feel like freedom, structured to feel like choice, inside an architecture that someone had begun building before she'd ever picked up the phone. She was standing in a courtyard in front of 400 witnesses and 3 cameras with a marriage certificate in her bag and a document in her hands that raised questions about both men flanking her, and she understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical in its sharpness, that she had walked out of one room last night and into another room, and both rooms had been built by someone other than herself. Her grip on the document tightened. Then, deliberately, she loosened it, finger by finger. She would not grip things. Not today. She looked at the crowd, at Lee Sang-chul, who had stopped typing, at the cameras, at her mother, who was watching her with an expression that said, I am here. Whatever this is, I am here. She thought, I have nothing but what's in my own name, my own mind, and the 23 pages I annotated. She thought, that's going to have to be enough. She lifted her head, squared her shoulders, looked at 400 people who had come to watch a wedding and were instead watching something that didn't have a name yet because it hadn't finished becoming itself. And she began to speak again, this time without a script, without a plan, working only from the raw. She found the words the way you find footing on a surface that keeps shifting, not gracefully, not with any of the polish she'd spent 15 years developing, but with the specific animal determination of someone who has decided they are not going down. "I want to tell you something true," she said. Her voice cracked slightly on the second word, and she let it crack, didn't correct it, didn't smooth it over. The crack was real, and real was the only thing she had left to work with. Not a prepared statement, not a position, something true. The courtyard was still. Lee Sang-chul had lowered his phone. The camera operator, who had moved forward, had stopped moving, was simply holding the frame, professional instinct overriding everything else. "I don't know," she said, "the full story of what either of these men has planned. I came here this morning believing I had made a choice. I may have made a more complicated one than I understood." She paused, breathed. Let the pause exist without filling it. "What I know, what I can tell you with certainty, is this. The work I did was real. The relationships I built were real. The foundation's impact was real. And none of that belongs to a man who built a cage around it while I was inside believing it was a home." She looked at Min-jae. "I want the board governance review," she said. "On record, in front of these witnesses. I'm requesting it now." Lee Sang-chul stood up again. This time he didn't sit back down, and the courtyard broke open. It didn't happen all at once. It moved in waves, the way crowd responses move, starting with the people closest to the center and expanding outward as the ones on the edges caught what was happening and added their own reactions to it. Two of Min-jae's closest allies in the third row exchanged a look that communicated volumes in the private language of men who had built arrangements together and were now calculating whether those arrangements still served them. A woman near the back, the wife of a city council member whose signature appeared on 3 of the foundation's government partnership agreements, stood up and began moving toward the aisle. Min-jae watched it happen. She could see him watching it, could see the specific quality of his attention as he tracked each defection, each shift, each small movement that represented a recalculation in someone else's mind. He had spent his entire adult life reading rooms. He was reading this one and he knew what he was seeing. He looked at Seoa. Seoa's composure had developed a hairline fracture across the eyes. She'd prepared for a confrontation with Zuri. She had not, Zuri suspected, fully prepared for Lee Sang-chul standing up, for the council member's wife leaving her seat, for the camera operator who had now been joined by a second, both of them moving closer with the quiet aggression of people who understood they were recording something that would matter. "Min-jae." Seoa's voice was low, urgent, directed at him with a precision that excluded everything else. "We need to—" "I know." He cut her off. His own voice had a quality she hadn't heard before, stripped, like a wire with the insulation burned off. He turned back to Zuri, stepped toward her. Jun-seok moved a fraction closer on her other side. Not a step, barely a shift, but present. And Min-jae stopped 4 feet away and looked at her with an expression that she would think about for a long time afterward. Not rage. Something older than rage. "The photograph," he said quietly. "Did you look at it carefully?" "I saw it." "Look again." She looked down at the bound document still in her hands. The photograph. Her at the far right. Jun-seok in the center. Director Choi in between. Min-jae said, "Look at what's on the table in front of Jun-seok." She looked. It took a moment. The image was slightly grainy, event photography rather than surveillance, the kind of ambient shots that got taken at corporate dinners. But on the table in front of where Jun-seok sat, half visible under the edge of his jacket, was a document. Just the top edge of it, just enough. The letterhead. Small, but legible if you were looking. Coleman Kong Foundation. And a date that was, she ran it fast, 7 months before the fiduciary agreement Seoa had described. 7 months before someone built the cage around her foundation, Jun-seok had been sitting at a table with a Coleman Kong Foundation document in front of him. Her chest did something complicated. "He's been adjacent to your work longer than he told you," Min-jae said. "I don't know his full play, but it's not what he presented to you at 1 in the morning." She looked up at Jun-seok. I was watching Min-jae with the flat attention of someone who has decided they are not going to be provoked into explaining themselves in a courtyard. "Jun-seok," her voice was even. "What was on that table?" A pause. 1 second. 2. A prospectus, he said. For what? The foundation's second phase expansion. I was reviewing it as a potential investor. You never disclosed that. It didn't advance past preliminary review. That's not what I said. She took one step toward him. I said you never disclosed it, to me, or to Minjae, or apparently to anyone, because if you had disclosed a prospectus review, it was preliminary. You would have appeared in our donor pipeline, and I would have known your name before we met at the Sungwon dinner. She stopped. Breath. But I didn't, because you reviewed a document about my work without identifying yourself, and then told me this morning we had no prior connection. Something shifted in Junseok's stillness. It became less like a wall and more like a man holding something in place manually. The omission, he said, was not intended to deceive you. What was it intended to do? He looked at her. Preserve optionality. She absorbed that. Preserve optionality. The language of a strategist. The language of a man who saw angles and maintained positions until the right moment to use them, which was a description that fit both men standing on opposite sides of her in this courtyard, with cameras rolling and 400 people watching. She was standing at the center of two separate long games, and she had been a piece in both of them without knowing the board. The anger arrived then. Not the contained architectural anger she'd been working with since midnight. Something raw, something that moved through her chest like heat and wanted out. She let it come. Didn't perform it, didn't weaponize it, just let it be present in her body where it lived. Both of you, she said, and her voice carried something that made the nearby guests take a half step back without realizing they'd done it, have been managing me. One of you for 6 years and one of you for God knows how long, and I walked into this courtyard this morning thinking I had made a choice, and what I actually did was execute a move in a game I didn't know I was playing. Minjae opened his mouth. Don't, she said. He closed it. I'm not finished, she said. I came here to tell the truth, so I'm going to tell it, all of it, including the parts that don't make either of you look like you think you look. She looked at the nearest camera directly. The Coleman Kong Foundation's governance structure contains a fiduciary lock that was installed without my knowledge. I am requesting today, publicly, that the board convene an emergency governance review. I am further requesting that all operating agreements connected to Beko Syndicate Holdings be suspended pending that review. She paused. I am also requesting that my co-signatories on the Singapore investment vehicle that Director COA identified be disclosed. Because if someone built a structure at my old address, I want to know who did it and why. And I want that documented before anyone in this courtyard makes any further decisions based on what they think they know. Lee Sang-chul was on the phone now, moving away from his row toward the outer edge of the courtyard. The council member's wife had found another woman. Zuri recognized her, a nonprofit director with connections to 3 different government ministries. And the two of them were talking with their heads together in the way of people making fast decisions. Minjae watched Lee Sang-chul's back. Zuri had seen Minjae lose leverage before. She'd watched it happen in 3 different rooms, and she'd watched him recover each time, watched him find the angle, apply the pressure, redirect. I was looking for the angle now. She could see him working. What she could also see, what she suspected he could not see because he was inside it, was that this time the room was different. This time the cameras were recording. This time, the story was already leaving this courtyard through every phone and every pocket in the assembled crowd, and a story that was already elsewhere could not be managed back into a room. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. Something moved through his face, fast, controlled, but she caught it. What? She said. He didn't answer. Minjae. What? He looked up at her, and she saw something she had genuinely never seen on his face in 6 years. A man who didn't have the next move. It lasted approximately 2 seconds before the control reasserted, but she'd seen it, and the fact that she'd seen it meant it was real. 2 of the Lim family's legal representatives, he said, are calling the Baeko operating office simultaneously. The Lim family. The relationship she'd built. The most significant legitimate business partnership the syndicate held. The one that made everything else credible. The one whose continuity clause was supposed to lock her in place. They were calling. Not the foundation. Not the charity committee. The operating office, which meant they were calling the business arm, which meant someone had reached them already. Faster than the courtyard had been running. faster than any phone call she'd made this morning. She looked at Jun Seok. Jun Seok said nothing, but his eyes went to a man near the cathedral entrance, a member of his security detail who was also looking at a phone and who gave a barely perceptible nod. "You contacted the Lim family," Zuri said. "I made a call this morning," he said, "before we left. Before I knew about the continuity clause." "Yes." "So before I knew I was locked in," she said slowly, "you were already cutting the lock. I was protecting your position. Or you were protecting your investment." She looked at him with the full focus she'd been rationing across the morning. "I am not a foundation acquisition, Jun Seok. I am a person who signed your paperwork at 4:30 in the morning because I believed you were giving me a choice." "I was." "Then tell me something true." She stepped toward him. "Not strategic, not carefully calibrated. True." She looked at his face. "Did you reach out to the Lim family before I called you last night?" The pause was 3 seconds. Each one of them cost her something. "I reached out to them 2 weeks ago," he said, "on a different matter." "What matter?" His jaw moved. "The terms of their operating agreement with Baeko, whether they would consider renegotiating their partnership structure. 2 weeks ago. He had begun untethering her most critical professional relationship from Min Jae's organization 2 weeks before she'd called him at midnight. He had been loosening the architecture of her position before she knew she needed an exit. Min Jae made a sound, not a word, something that started as a word and didn't make it. He looked at Jun Seok, and the look between them was 15 years of accumulated history, professional, adversarial, personal in the way that long enmity becomes personal, compressed into approximately 2 seconds of eye contact. "You've been planning this," Min Jae said. "I've been positioning," Jun Seok said. "There's a difference." "There isn't." "I never lied to her." I omitted a prospectus review that didn't advance. You omitted a second marriage you were actively planning." Jun Seok's voice was even, almost bored, but there was a pressure beneath it. "Our omissions are not equivalent." Min Jae took 3 fast steps across the stone, and Zuri moved without thinking, stepped directly between them, put herself in the 4 feet of space before it could close, and both men stopped. She was aware, immediately, of how dangerous this position was. Not physically, not in this courtyard with cameras and 400 witnesses, but in the specific gravity of 2 forces directed at each other with her as the point of convergence. She felt the pressure of it from both sides simultaneously, like standing in a current. "Stop," she said. Neither of them moved, neither of them stepped back. "I said stop." Her voice came out hard and low, and both men looked at her. "I am not a territory. I am not a negotiating position. I am not a piece on your board that either of you gets to fight over in front of cameras." She looked at Min Jae. "You lost me last night. That's done." She looked at Jun Seok. "And you? I don't know yet what you did and why you did it, and I am not going to make a decision about that in a courtyard." She stepped back from between them. Her heels found the stone, and she let it hold her. "Here is what's happening right now," she said, loud enough for the crowd. "I am withdrawing from every advisory position, every board seat, every executive role connected to the Baeko Syndicate's legitimate arms, effective immediately. The mechanism for how that works legally is something that will be resolved through proper channels, and the board governance review I've requested will determine what can and cannot be contested." She looked at COA. "The Singapore entity and the transfer records you presented, I want those documents, all of them, copied and submitted to my legal counsel by end of day. Not as a negotiating chip, as a legal record." COA looked at Min Jae. Min Jae said nothing. "If those documents contain evidence of identity fraud," Zuri continued, "I will pursue it legally, regardless of who it implicates, either of you." She held COA's eyes, "Including you." COA's composure held. Barely. Something in her posture had changed. The high, prepared stillness had softened marginally in the way of someone who has fired their planned ammunition and is recalculating. "The documents were presented as disclosure," she said, "not as a threat." "I know what they were presented as," Zuri said. "I'm telling you what they're going to be used as." A commotion at the cathedral entrance. She didn't look immediately. She'd learned, in this courtyard, to let her peripheral vision work before redirecting her attention. 2 men in the dark suits that indicated professional security rather than guest attire. They moved with the specific economy of motion that meant they had a purpose, and the purpose was not the event. They were Junseok's. She knew it before she confirmed it, because Min Jae's security would have come from a different direction. Junseok glanced at them. Something passed between him and the nearer one. Not a signal, just awareness, the way men who work together communicate without language. "There's a development," Junseok said quietly, angling slightly toward Zuri. "The Baeko operating office has issued a statement to two of the networks present in the last 8 minutes." She looked at him. "What statement?" "Confirming the legitimacy of the Coleman Kong Foundation's independent governance structure." He paused. "And denying that any fiduciary restrictions exist." The ground shifted again. She looked at Min Jae. Min Jae's expression had closed entirely. He was a wall now, not a man. Whatever had been readable in his face 12 minutes ago was gone. "You issued a statement," she said. He said nothing. "Min Jae," she stepped toward him. "You issued a statement denying the fiduciary clause exists." "What exists legally," he said very carefully, "and what can be enforced in the current public environment are two different things." She stared at him. What he was telling her, encoded in the language of a man who had spent a lifetime saying things that meant other things, was that he had released her. Not willingly, not freely, but the cameras and the witnesses and Lee Sang-chul's phone calls and the Lim family's representatives calling the operating office simultaneously had created a public environment in which attempting to enforce the fiduciary clause would cost him more than releasing it. He was letting her go because holding her had become more expensive than the alternative. She wanted, for one sharp second, to feel relief. But what she felt instead was something dirtier and more honest, a kind of exhausted fury at a world in which freedom arrived not as a gift, but as a calculation. At the specific indignity of being released by a man who couldn't give you a choice until the audience made it cheaper to. "Thank you," she said. Flat. Not grateful. Not contemptuous. Just marking the fact. She turned to the crowd. Across the stone, 400 people who had dressed for a wedding and witnessed something they would be explaining for years. She looked at their faces, confused, riveted, calculating, in several cases visibly moved, and she let herself see them. Not as an audience, as people who had come here believing in the story they'd been told and were now holding the pieces of a different one. "The wedding is canceled," she said simply. "I'd asked the event coordinator to work with the catering team to redirect today's arrangements, the food, the flowers, the decorations, to the charity distribution list I'll provide within the hour." She paused. "The celebration was budgeted. The cause is still good. The rest of it isn't." A sound moved through the crowd. Not applause, not shock. Something in between. A collective exhale. The sound of a story changing shape and the audience adjusting to the new one. Her mother was on her feet. Standing in the 4th row, both hands pressed flat against her sternum, watching her daughter with an expression that contained more information than Zuri could process right now. She met her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Her mother gave one small, tight nod. She had to look away. Had to. Because her mother's face was the one thing in this courtyard that could undo her, and she had not come this far to come undone in front of cameras. Junseok spoke quietly beside her. "We should move." "Not yet." "Zuri, I said not yet." She turned to face him, and she looked at him with everything she had. The sleepless night, the 23 annotated pages, the Lim family call he'd made 2 weeks ago, the prospectus on the table at the Sungwon dinner, the question, "Are you safe?" and the way it had landed and the way she'd let it land. "When we get in that car, I need you to tell me everything, from the beginning, not the version that's good for you, the actual sequence. Because I am not going to build another life inside information someone else is managing." He looked at her. His face did something subtle. Not quite guilt, not quite relief. Something in between. "Yes," he said. And if I don't like what I hear..." "The exit clause is in paragraph 9, he said. "The terms are yours." She held his eyes for 3 more seconds. Then she turned back to the courtyard one last time. Min Jae was standing where she'd left him. Seoa was beside him. They were not touching. They were not looking at each other. They were standing side by side in front of 400 people and 3 cameras, and the weight of everything that had been said and everything that couldn't be unsaid, and they were standing separately, not together. Two people who had won a plan and lost the thing the plan was for. Zuri looked at Min-jae once more. He was looking at her. For a long moment, it was just that. Two people who had known each other across 6 years of real time, looking at each other across 30 feet of stone in a courtyard that had seen more than it bargained for this morning. She thought about what to say. Thought about the hotel suite and the cigar and the 6 years in the cage and the Lim family call and Lee Sang-chul standing up and her mother's face and the 23 pages and the 2 seconds when Min-jae's face had shown her a man without a next move. She thought about all of it. She said, "I was loyal. You were entitled. Those are not the same thing." The courtyard held it. Min-jae's face did something she would not be able to describe later. Something that moved through it like weather, like something real briefly surfacing before the architecture of him pressed it back down. His jaw worked. His hands were still at his sides. He did not speak. She turned. Walked toward the courtyard entrance where the black cars waited. Jun-seok fell into step beside her. Amara materialized from somewhere on her left, and she was grateful for it in the wordless way you're grateful for solid ground. Behind her, she heard the courtyard beginning to dissolve. The sound of hundreds of people standing, moving, talking, the particular ambient noise of a crowd released from the grip of something and shaking itself back into individual lives. Someone was already on a phone, several people probably. The story was already moving faster than any of them. She didn't look back. She had nothing left to prove to that particular room. But at the gate, just before the cars, she stopped. Her hand found Amara's arm. "The Singapore entity," she said quietly. "I need the registration records pulled tonight. Everything, every director, every transaction, every document attached to that address." Amara was already writing something. "Got it. And I need my attorney on the phone by the time we reach the Hannum estate. He's already called twice." Of course he had. She nodded, took a breath. The morning air outside the cathedral courtyard was cooler than inside it. Or maybe that was just the difference between standing in a room full of people and standing in the open. She could feel the spaces between her fingers, could feel her own heartbeat, which had been a constant background percussion for the past 40 minutes, and was only now beginning to slow. The car door was open. Jun-seok was waiting. She looked at the city. Seoul spread out in every direction, stone and glass, and the distant silver line of the river, the city that had been the site of 6 years of her life and was now going to be the site of whatever came next. It was a beautiful city. It had always been a beautiful city. That hadn't changed. She got in the car. The door closed. Jun-seok settled into the seat beside her and the car began to move, and she turned to look at him in the specific privacy of a moving vehicle with tinted windows, where neither of them had an audience and the performance requirements of the courtyard were over. "Start from the beginning," she said. He looked at her, steady, load-bearing. He opened his mouth, and from Jun-seok's jacket pocket, his phone rang with the specific ringtone she'd heard him assign in that study at 2 in the morning to exactly one contact, the one he'd described as his most sensitive professional relationship, the one whose calls he took regardless of hour, the one whose name she had not seen but whose existence she had filed away as information she didn't have yet. He looked at the screen. His expression did not change, but his hand, briefly, before he controlled it, tightened around the phone. She watched his hand. "Are you going to answer that?" she said. He looked up at her. Outside the window, Seoul kept moving, the river appearing in the gap between buildings, the light on the water, the city that held 10 million lives and didn't particularly notice. He answered it. That was the thing. He looked at the screen, looked at her, and answered it. Not with the smooth reflex of someone with nothing to hide, but with the deliberate quality of a man who had decided that hiding it was the worse option. He pressed the phone to his ear and said 2 words in Korean that she caught well enough. "Not now." Then he ended the call and put the phone face down on the seat between them. Outside, Seoul moved past in pieces. A bridge. A line of trees. The river going silver in the late morning light. "Who was that?" she said. He was quiet for 3 seconds, long enough for her to count them. "Director Choi," he said. "From the Sungwon dinner." The man who had sat between them. The introduction Jun-seok had claimed was minimal, peripheral. "He calls you directly," she said. "We have a professional relationship." "How long?" 12 years. She absorbed that. 12 years. Director Choi, who had spent the last 6 years in an advisory capacity to the Coleman Kong Foundation's Government Liaison Committee. Director Choi, whose signature appeared on 2 of the foundation's most significant public-private partnership agreements. Director Choi, who had never, in 6 years of working adjacent to Zuri, identified himself as someone with a 12-year relationship to the man who would become her emergency husband at 4:30 in the morning. The car moved through a left turn, and she watched the driver's hands on the wheel and gave herself the interior silence to think rather than speak. "Tell me what Choi is to you," she said finally. Jun-seok turned to face her more fully, which she recognized as a physical commitment to honesty, the body choosing transparency before the mouth was ready. "He's been a conduit between my organization and certain government channels. He's not on my payroll. He's not a member of Dragon Crown. He's a man who finds it professionally useful to maintain relationships on both sides of a line and has done so for longer than I've known him. And his role in the foundation was independent of his relationship to me." "Was it?" A pause, shorter than the last one. "Mostly." She looked at him. "Mostly." "His initial nomination to the Foundation's advisory committee came through a channel I had access to," Jun-seok said. "I didn't place him there, but I didn't object when his name came forward, and I knew his placement would give me visibility into Foundation operations without direct involvement." The car was very quiet. Even the engine was quiet, the specific hush of a vehicle engineered to insulate its occupants from the world outside, which right now felt like the most ironic possible environment for this conversation. "So for 6 years," Zuri said slowly, "you had a set of eyes in my organization. A source of information, not operational access. That distinction," she said, "matters to you more than it does to me." She felt the anger moving through her again. Not the hot, surface anger of the courtyard, but something deeper, something that lived in the chest cavity and had been building since she'd seen Jun-seok's name on a document at a table where she'd been told he wasn't. "You have been adjacent to my professional life for 6 years, while I was in a relationship with your primary rival, while I was building an organization that touched your interests and his interests, and apparently Choi's interests, and not once, not one time in 6 years, did you identify yourself. If I had identified myself, I know why you didn't." Her voice had gone flat. "I know the strategic logic. I'm telling you what it cost." She paused. "I'm telling you that I spent 6 years believing I was building something of my own inside a world where I was the only one who didn't know the full map." Was quiet. The right kind of quiet, not defensive, not calculating, the quiet of someone receiving something they deserve to receive and choosing not to deflect. "Yes," he said. She looked at him. "That's all? What do you want me to say?" "I want you to say something true. I told you that." He looked out the window. She watched the side of his face, the jaw, the temple, the particular set of a man's eyes when he is looking at something external but thinking about something internal. He had a face that defaulted to composure, the way some faces default to openness, and she understood now that what she'd initially read as steadiness was at least partly architecture, the same way Min-jae's confidence had been architecture. Different materials, same function. "I noticed you," he said, "before I was supposed to notice you, before it was strategically relevant. The first time I saw you in a room, not the Sungwon dinner, before that, at an industry function I wasn't supposed to be at, and wasn't publicly identified as attending, you were handling a difficult donor in a way that I found—" He stopped. Started again. "I found it difficult to look away from." She waited. "I didn't approach you then because you were with Min-jae, and because I wasn't ready to be the kind of man who approached someone in that circumstance." He turned from the window and looked at her. "When you called me last night, I had been, for 2 years, holding a position that I believed I would either use or not use, depending on what happened. The Lim family called 2 weeks ago. I heard something that suggested Min-jae's timeline was accelerating, the second marriage, the fiduciary lock. I heard it from Choi." He held her eyes. "I made a call that was part preparation and part something I wasn't fully honest with myself about." She studied him. "And the prenuptial agreement, letting me write my own terms. That was genuine." "Everything you did in that study was genuine." "Yes, including the parts you didn't tell me." He didn't flinch, including those. She sat with that. The car made another turn and the Hannam estate appeared at the end of the approach road. The garden wall and the gate and the morning light coming through the trees the way it did at this hour when the angle was right. "I need to think," she said. "I know." About whether the document at the Sungwon dinner and Choi's placement and the Lim call are the whole accounting or whether there's more. There isn't more. You'd tell me if there was. He held her gaze. I would tell you if there was, because you'd find it anyway, and because… He paused, and what came across his face then was not a performance. She'd seen enough performed emotions in the past 12 hours to know the difference. Because the version of this where you find it yourself is the version where you leave. And I've been holding a position for 2 years for a reason. The car stopped. The gate was open. The driver sat silent and professional and entirely unseen in the front seat. She looked at the gate, the garden wall, the modest house beyond it with the worn leather chair in the study and her grandmother's photographs on the landing. The things that were hers, the home she had kept secret for 3 years, which was the most revealing thing she'd ever done without knowing she was doing it. She opened the car door herself. She got out, stood on the path for a moment, breathing the garden air, which smelled of the season and the morning and nothing in particular, which was a relief after a courtyard that had smelled of flowers and tension and 400 people's rerouted expectations. She heard the other door open, heard Jun Seok's footsteps on the path, stopping a few feet behind her. "Come inside," she said. Not warmly, not coldly, just as a fact. He followed her in. The house was exactly as she'd left it at 8:30 this morning, which felt like a different geological era. The kitchen light was still on. Her water glass from the night before was still on the counter. She picked it up, rinsed it, put it in the rack, because she was home now, and small ordered actions were the things that kept larger chaos from spreading into every surface. Amara came through the door behind them, shoes off before she crossed the threshold because that was Amara's way, and she went directly to the kitchen and began making tea with the specific purposeful silence of someone who understood that the room required useful action rather than words. Zuri went to the study, sat in the leather chair, felt the familiar weight of it against her back. Her attorney called at 11:14 a.m. She answered and they talked for 31 minutes, and by the end of it she had a clear accounting of what the Foundation's governance review would require, what could be challenged, what the Singapore entity's documentation would mean if it established identity fraud, and what her legal position was as of this morning. It was not a simple position. It was not a clean one. But it was hers, and it was documented, and it had legs. Jun Seok sat in the room while she talked, not in a secondary seat. He took the chair across from her desk, which was a choice, and he sat with his elbows on his knees and listened without pretending not to. She let him listen. Part of establishing what this was going to be was seeing how he occupied space when he wasn't performing for anyone. He occupied it quietly. That was something. When the call ended, she put the phone down and said, "Director Choi needs to disclose his relationship with your organization to the Foundation Board as a precondition of any continued advisory role." That ends his advisory role. "I know." Jun Seok was quiet for a moment. "I'll contact him today. I'll contact the board chair today. The disclosure comes from you independently. I'm not managing the communication for you." He nodded. "Understood. And the Singapore entity," she said. "I need to know if it has any connection to Dragon Crown. Any at all. Not adjacent. Not through a conduit. Any." He looked at her steadily. "I have no Singapore entity at that address." "I believe you," she said, contingently. "My attorney is running the corporate records. If anything surfaces, it won't. I will pursue it legally regardless of our current arrangement." She held his eyes. "That's not a negotiating position. That's the condition under which I remain in this house today." "I know," he said. "It's the condition under which you should remain." She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back. Neither of them filled the silence, and the silence was fine. It was a working silence, the kind that had information in it rather than avoidance. "Why didn't you tell Min Jae," she said, "when you first began paying attention to the Foundation? He would have noticed a competitor surveilling his organization's operations." Minji didn't know the extent of my observation. Choi maintained separation. Jun Seok's jaw moved slightly. "But also, I didn't want Minjae to know I was watching you, specifically, not the organization. You. That landed quietly. She let it land. Because if he knew you were watching me specifically, she said, it would tell him something. Yes. It would tell him you considered me worth watching independently, not as an extension of him. Yes. She thought about that. About what it meant for someone in Jun Seok's position, in his world, to have tracked a rival's partner independently for 2 years. Not operationally, not as an asset, as a person worth attention in their own right. She was too honest with herself to let the flattery of that obscure the problem, but she was also too honest to pretend it didn't register. All right, she said. All right, he said. She stood up, her feet hurt, which she registered now for the first time since the hotel room last night. The specific ache of a body that has been held in high-stress posture for too many hours in the wrong shoes. She was still in the wedding dress. The realization came with a quality of absurdity that almost broke the surface of her composure. She looked down at herself. I need to change, she said. Yes, he said, with a neutrality that was also, she thought, the barest edge of something else. She went upstairs. The bedroom was the one room in the estate she'd furnished with the most care, the mattress she'd chosen after testing 12, the curtains that were the specific weight of fabric she'd wanted since seeing something similar in a hotel in Marrakech 7 years ago, the mirror that stood in the corner because she'd found it at a market in Itaewon, and it had the slight warm imperfection of old glass that she found far more interesting than perfect reflection. She unzipped the wedding dress herself, slowly, because the zipper was in the back and required the specific contortion she'd practiced at the fitting. She stepped out of it, hung it on the back of the door, and stood in the afternoon light of her own bedroom, in her own home, in her own country, of chosen residence, and breathed. She thought about Minjae. She let herself think about him without the armor of the courtyard, or the presence of cameras, or the weight of witnesses. Thought about 6 years of mornings in a kitchen that had been theirs, about the specific sound of his voice in the dark, when he was almost asleep, and said things that felt true because unconscious, about the engraved ring she'd left on a dresser in a hotel room she would never go back to. She thought about all of it, and she let it hurt the amount it hurt, which was significant, which was not nothing, which was the honest accounting. He had loved her, she thought. In the limited architecture of what he was capable of, he had loved her. He had also believed, simultaneously and without apparent contradiction, that love entitled him to the terms he set. That being loved back was the same as being owed whatever he decided the relationship needed to be. That was the thing she kept returning to. Not the betrayal of the hotel suite, but the bafflement in his eyes. When she left it, the genuine confusion of a man encountering a response he hadn't calculated for. He had not calculated for her leaving because he had believed love was a fixed position, something that held still while he moved around it. She had not been a fixed position. She pulled on clothes, dark trousers, a gray shirt, flat shoes, and looked at herself in the imperfect mirror and thought, this is what you look like now. Take a picture with your memory. You won't be exactly this person again either. Amara knocked on the door frame. Tea is cold. I made more. Thank you. Also. Amara held up her phone. The screen showed a news site. The headline was in Korean, but the image was the courtyard, the ivory dress, the document envelope held at a specific angle in morning light. It's everywhere. How bad? Depends on your definition. Amara tilted her head. The Foundation's donor phone line has received 47 calls in the last hour. 39 of them are pledges. 8 are withdrawals. 39 to 8. She did the math on what that meant for the Foundation's public standing and felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight since Seoa had walked through the crowd with those documents. Minjae? She said. His office issued a statement 20 minutes ago, confirming the wedding did not take place. No further details. Seoa? Nothing public. The Singapore entity? Amara lowered her phone. Your attorney's office called while you were changing. The entity registration came back clean. No Dragon Crown connection. No Beko connection either. She paused. It was registered by a shell entity in the Cayman Islands that traces back to Director Choi's personal investment portfolio. Zuri stood very still. Choi. Not Minjae. Not Jun Seok. Choi, who had sat between them at the Sungwon dinner. Choi, whose signature was on 2 of the Foundation's partnership agreements. Choi, who had been feeding information to Jun Seok, and who had apparently also been running a parallel operation using Zuri's old address to build a financial entity that she had no knowledge of. What was the entity used for? She said. 3 transactions, all transfers to a legal firm in Zurich. The dates span 18 months. The most recent is 4 months ago. Amara paused. The legal firm in Zurich specializes in international asset protection and discrete wealth management. She moved money, Zuri thought, through a structure built on my identity. And when the Singapore document surfaced in COA's folder this morning, the assumption, the designed assumption, was that the trail would lead to Zuri herself or to someone adjacent to her, and whichever direction it pointed would create enough doubt to neutralize her. The COA gambit wasn't about proving Zuri was complicit. It was about introducing the possibility, in a courtyard full of cameras, at the moment when Zuri's credibility was the only thing she had. She went downstairs. Jun Seok was in the kitchen. He was standing at the counter with his jacket off, sleeves pushed up, looking at his phone with the focused attention of a man reading something that required concentration. He looked up when she came in, and whatever was in her face made him put the phone down immediately. "Choi," she said. His expression shifted. "What about him?" "The Singapore entity is his, through a Cayman shell." She watched Jun Seok's face as she said it, and watched it absorb the information in real time, the flash of something, surprise or its functional equivalent, the recalibration. The transfers traced to a Zurich firm he uses for personal wealth management. He built a corporate structure at my old address, ran money through it, and those documents ended up in Seoa's folder. Jun Seok set the phone fully down. "I didn't know." "I know you didn't know," she said. "You had just told me he was a conduit, and you'd told me that in the car. If you'd known about the entity, you'd have warned me before Seoa produced it." "How long has he—" 18 months minimum. The first transfer was 18 months ago. She leaned against the doorframe. "Who else was he feeding information to?" Jun Seok was quiet for 4 seconds. She could see him running something. "He was positioned between 3 organizations," he said finally. "Mine, Minjae's, and the Foundation. He's been managing information flows in all 3 directions for longer than I understood." He looked up at her. "If he built that entity 18 months ago, and it was designed to surface in this specific circumstance, he knew the plan," Zuri said. "The second marriage, the fiduciary lock. He knew about it and built a contingency document that could be produced at the right moment. Not for Minjae, not for you, for himself. A lever." "Over whom?" "All of us." She straightened. "He has a document trail implicating an address associated with my identity. He has a 12-year relationship with you. He has signatures on 2 foundation agreements and a position on the advisory committee. If today had gone differently, if I'd been publicly associated with financial irregularities while simultaneously turning on Minji's organization, Choi would have been the only person in this situation with clean hands and leverage over everyone." The kitchen was quiet. Amara was in the hallway, not pretending not to listen, which Zuri respected. Jun Seok said, with a precision that cut through the morning like something physical, "He played us both." "He played all 3 of us," Zuri said. "You, Minjae, and me. He was positioned in the overlap between all 3 of our interests for 6 years, and he built an exit strategy that used all 3 of us as cover." She moved to the kitchen table and sat down. The chair was solid and real, and she felt its realness acutely, the specific physical comfort of a surface that was simply what it appeared to be. "I need to call my attorney again," she said. "I need to make some calls as well." "Your calls?" she said, looking up at him. "Stay out of my legal strategy. Whatever you do about Choi on your end is your business. What happens to those documents and the corporate records and the foundation implications is mine." "Agreed." "And Jun Seok?" She held his eyes. "If in the next 24 hours anything else surfaces that tells me you knew more than you've said today, anything, any detail, any proximity I wasn't told about, this is over. The arrangement, the marriage, everything." He looked at her, didn't hesitate. "I understand." "Good." She picked up her phone. "There's a second bathroom upstairs. Amara can find you a shirt from the closet in the blue room. There are things in there I kept for guests, and they'll likely fit." He paused. "You're offering me a room." "I'm offering you a shirt and a bathroom. Whether you stay or go after that is your decision." She looked at him over the phone. I'm not managing your schedule for you. Something at the edge of his expression. That not quite smile, the one she'd clocked in the car the night before. No, he said. You're not. He went upstairs. She called her attorney. The next 4 hours were the most concentrated work she had done in memory, and she had done a great deal of concentrated work. Her attorney's office filed the governance review request with the foundation board by 2 p.m. The filing was public record. Lee Sang-chul, who had been making calls from the moment he stood up in the courtyard, had already spoken to 3 other board members before the filing hit, which meant the review had probable majority support before it was formally requested. By 3:15, the foundation's interim executive director, a woman named Kwon Ji-young, who had been running day-to-day operations for 2 years, and who Zuri had specifically chosen for that role because she was competent and unimpressed by hierarchy, had sent Zuri a single-line email that read, "Review is proceeding. Your access and credentials are active and undisputed. The board's position is that you have been acting in the foundation's interest throughout. Governance irregularities will be investigated separately." She read that email 3 times, set the phone down, picked it up, read it once more. The fiduciary clause was gone, not legally dissolved yet, that would take the review, but practically neutralized. The board had chosen her publicly. The cage had turned out to have a door the moment enough people inside it decided to open it. She put the phone down and sat quietly for 3 minutes. Then she stood up and went to the window and looked at the garden wall and thought about what it meant to have built something that held up under pressure. Not because she had protected it perfectly. She hadn't. She had missed the governance insertion. She had signed something without reading the full subsidiary structure. She had made assumptions about the security of what she was building that turned out to be assumptions rather than facts. She had made mistakes. The foundation had held anyway because she had staffed it right and managed it with enough integrity that when it came to a vote, the people inside it chose the thing she'd made over the man who'd tried to control it. That was something. That was, in fact, the thing. Jun Seok came downstairs at 3:40 in one of the gray shirts from the blue room closet, which fit him across the shoulders imperfectly but functionally, which was about right, she thought, for where they were. He sat at the kitchen table and told her what he'd done. He had spoken to Choi directly, had made clear that the Singapore entity and its documentation were known to Zuri's attorneys, and had ended the 12-year relationship with 5 sentences and no room for negotiation. He had also spoken to the Lim family's representative and confirmed that the renegotiation of their operating agreement would proceed as a separate matter, independent of any foundation review, and on terms that did not involve Baeko Syndicate at any level. How did Choi respond, she said. He asked if there was room to discuss. And? I said no. Jun Seok's voice was flat. He built a financial structure on your identity and positioned it to surface in a way that would implicate you publicly. There is no discussion that addresses that. She studied him. You're angry. Yes. About the betrayal or about the fact that he got that close without you seeing it? A pause. Then, with the honesty she was beginning to recognize as a consistent quality rather than an occasional one. Both. Primarily the second. She nodded. That she understood. The specific humiliation of discovering you were less perceptive than you believed yourself to be was its own particular weight. She'd been carrying a version of it since midnight and expected to carry it for some time. It's honest, at least, she said. I try to be. You try to be honest when honesty serves your position, she said, not unkindly. Today it serves your position to be thorough. I'm watching for the day it doesn't. He looked at her. Fair. Yes, she said. It is. The light in the kitchen was changing. The afternoon going long and gold in the way it did when the season was turning and the sun began its earlier descent. Amara had left 2 hours ago with a list of tasks and the particular efficiency that meant everything on the list would be handled. The house was quiet. The specific quiet of a place that had held a great deal of noise and was settling back into itself. Her mother called at 4:30. She answered it in the study, alone, in the leather chair, with the door half closed because this conversation required a degree of privacy that the open kitchen didn't provide. Mama? Baby. Her mother's voice had the texture of someone who had been sitting with something difficult for hours. Are you in one piece? More or less? More or less? A sound that was not quite a laugh. Zuri Adaeze, I have been sitting in a cathedral room drinking somebody's leftover champagne, trying to figure out if I raised a genius or a woman with a death wish. Maybe both. Maybe both, her mother agreed. Then, that man, the second one, Jun Seok. Yes. He looked at you differently than Min-jae did. She paused. What do you mean? Min-jae looked at you the way a man looks at something he owns. Her mother's voice was steady and precise, the voice of a woman who had seen enough of the world to name it accurately. The other one looked at you the way a man looks at something he's not sure he deserves. Zuri sat with that, in the leather chair, in the quiet house, in the afternoon light. That's not nothing, her mother continued. It's not everything either, but it's not nothing. I know. You married him. I did. In the middle of the night. Yes. A long breath on the line. I'm going to need you to tell me this whole story, from the beginning, not the version you think I can handle. I know, Mama. But not today. Her mother's voice softened. Today, I want you to eat something. Whatever you had at that cathedral wasn't enough. I could see it in your face. Despite everything, or maybe because of everything, she almost smiled. I'll eat something. And sleep, eventually. Zuri. Yes, Mama. You were magnificent today. Her mother said it simply, without performance. Whatever else happens with any of it, you were magnificent. She held the phone against her ear and said nothing for a moment because there was a specific kind of love that didn't require a response, and this was that kind, and she let it land the way it wanted to without deflecting it. Thank you, she said. I'll call you tomorrow. She sat in the chair after the call ended and let the house be quiet around her. Min-jae's office issued a second statement at 5:47 p.m. She read it on her phone. It was formal and brief and contained no direct mention of her name or the wedding. It confirmed that Kang Min-jae remained at the helm of the Baiko Syndicate and its legitimate business arms, and that the organization would be making several strategic announcements in the coming week regarding governance structure. Reading between the lines with 6 years of familiarity, she understood what those announcements would involve. A restructuring that placed Seo-ah in a visible operational role while quietly repositioning Min-jae away from the public-facing commitments that Zuri had managed. He was already adapting. That was who he was. She had always known who he was. She was just now finished being surprised that he was that person through and through. She sent one message, to his direct number, which she did not yet delete. 3 sentences. The Foundation Governance Review will proceed without interference from either of us. I will not be making further public statements about events prior to today. I wish you a life that doesn't require someone else's sacrifice to sustain it. She did not wait to see if he responded. She put the phone in her bag and left the study. Jun Seok was in the garden. She saw him through the kitchen window before she went out, standing near the far wall where the light came through a gap in the stone and made a specific pattern on the ground in late afternoon. He wasn't on his phone. He wasn't doing anything. He was just standing in the light with his hands at his sides, looking at nothing in particular, which was either a performance of peace or the actual thing, and she was going to have to spend more time with him to know which. She went out through the back door. The garden smelled of earth and late-season growth, the particular combination of green and cool that she had specifically negotiated into the lease because she needed something alive outside her windows. She walked to where he was standing, stopped a few feet away. The light was the same on her as on him. They stood like that for a moment, not touching, not performing, just 2 people who had signed papers at 4:17 in the morning and spent the subsequent 12 hours in the specific productive chaos of decisions made without all available information. The garden was quiet, a bird in the wall somewhere, traffic distantly on the other side. The city living its ordinary life at the edges of their very non-ordinary day. The board confirmed the review, she said. I know. Amara texted me. Of course she had. Choi? My attorneys have the documentation. His position is being made very uncomfortable in several directions simultaneously. He paused. He will not be a problem. That's the kind of sentence that can mean a lot of different things. It means legally and professionally, he said, directly, without irritation. I'm not Min-jae. She looked at him sideways. You're also not someone who got to this position by being harmless. No, he said. I'm not. He looked back. But harmless was never what you needed. She thought about that. Thought about the first 28 years of her life, the years of building and proving and earning every room she was supposed to have been given and wasn't, and the 6 years after that of building something she believed was shared and turned out to be managed, and the 12 hours most recently of discovering that freedom and a cage can look very similar from inside them if the builder is skilled enough. What she needed, she was still compiling that list. I don't know yet, she said, what this is. She gestured between them, a small movement. What we are. I know what the paper says. I don't know what the paper means yet. I know, he said. I need time. Real time. Not managed time. I'm not going anywhere, he said, and I'm not going to push. She studied him. His profile in the late light, the steadiness of it, the load-bearing quality she'd noted since 1 a.m. and hadn't stopped noting. He had made moves without telling her. He had omitted things that mattered. He had also ended a 12-year relationship in the same day he was told it had been weaponized against the woman he'd married without consulting his organizational interests first. She was holding all of those things simultaneously and refusing to resolve them prematurely, which was the mature approach, and also felt like carrying 4 things in hands designed for 2. The Hannum estate, she said. It's mine, it stays mine. I know. If we figure out, if this becomes something that involves actually living together or building something, that gets renegotiated on terms I set. The paragraph 9 structure applies to everything. I know, he said again, and there was something in his voice that was not submission and not strategy. Something simpler, more worn in. Something that sounded like a man who had been waiting for someone to insist on fair terms and found the insistence itself to be the thing. All right, she said. All right, he said. The light in the garden was doing what light did in the last hour before it gave out entirely, going warm and particular, finding the edges of things, and making them briefly more defined before the dark took the detail away. She stood in it and felt it on her face and thought about the morning's ivory dress hanging on the back of her bedroom door, the one she had chosen in Milan for a life she had genuinely wanted. She still wanted a life. Just the right one. The one she'd been building toward since before she had the words for what she was building toward. The one where the work was real and the partnership was actual, and the home was a place that kept its shape instead of turning out to be something someone else could revoke. She was not there yet. She knew she was not there yet. The legal complications alone would take months. The foundation review, the choice situation, the renegotiation of operating agreements, the slow, unglamorous work of extracting 6 years of professional entanglement from a relationship that had turned out to be something other than what she'd signed on for. None of it was clean. None of it was done. She was 34 years old and starting over in the specific way that wasn't starting from zero, but was still, genuinely starting. The kind that required you to look honestly at what you'd been carrying and decide which of it was worth picking up again and which of it you set down here and walked away from. She thought about Min Jae in the antechamber, the look on his face when she'd named what she was to him and he hadn't argued. She thought about the ring she'd left on the dresser. She thought about 6 years of mornings. She thought about the cigar. She let herself think all of it, fully, without managing it or flattening it into a lesson or rushing toward the part where she was okay. The bird in the wall went quiet. The light went another shade warmer. Come inside, she said. I'll cook something. He looked at her. Something moved through his expression. Surprise, she thought, genuine surprise at the domesticity of it. The plainness of an offer to cook in a garden after the kind of day they'd had. She found she was glad to have surprised him. It felt like useful information. All right, he said. They went inside. The kitchen was its ordinary self. The light she'd chosen for this room, the counter space she'd used 100 quiet evenings, the refrigerator that held the contents of a life lived simply and on her own terms. She opened it and took stock and found enough for something real, and she began to work without speaking, and he sat at the table without filling the silence, and the house held them both with the straightforward reliability of a structure built for exactly this. Not for performance, not for audience, but for the ordinary and demanding work of being human inside a shelter you chose for yourself. She cooked. The kitchen smelled of something warm and specific. The city moved outside the garden wall in its usual enormous, indifferent life. She thought, this is a beginning, a complicated, imperfect, fully awake beginning. She thought, that's the only kind worth having. She put 2 plates on the table and sat across from Han Jun-seok in her own kitchen, in her own home, and they ate. And outside the window, the Seoul evening settled into itself. And the day that had started with a cigar in a hotel room and a ring left on a dresser closed quietly around the edges of something that was not yet a story, but was, finally, genuinely, hers.